had a conference in Budapest.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I think we can get started. So welcome everybody. I have the great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is Annette Baudisch from Denmark. And so Annette got her diploma in Germany, in Rostock, Germany, in mathematical economics. And then she moved to the UK, to UCL, where she did her PhD in the area of aging. And she wrote a thesis, quite a bold thesis actually, where she questioned the inevitability of senescence, which was, I'm saying this was a brave move because that was something treated as a dogma established by no one else than Bill Hamilton. And then she spent some years as a visiting assistant professor at the Duke University, and then she moved to the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, where she was deputy director and then a group leader focusing on demographic aspects of aging. And from 2014, she moved back to to Denmark, where she is currently. She's a professor for evolutionary demography at the University of Southern Denmark, and currently vice director at the Interdisciplinary Center on Population Dynamics. And so that's a very fresh news that she also got a prestigious grant from the ERC Consolidator grant, just a few days ago. That was the big news, and so we congratulate her on that. And so Annette is a leading figure in the field of evolution of senescence or aging, and she has published her results in the most important journals of the field, including Science, Nature, many in PNAS, and so forth. And in one relatively recent book about aging, an entire section was devoted to her work. So she's really someone important in this field, and we are really looking forward to hearing her work in this field. So Annette, your virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam, for your very kind introduction. And I'm very happy for this invitation, and it dates back already many years that Adam actually invited me, and I'm glad finally we could make it happen. And so today I'm speaking about the evolution of aging and lifespan, which indeed goes back to my PhD thesis, but I will draw the line up until today. So just to give you an overview, I will start out with the classic theory on the evolution of aging and the basic questions there, and then present you some life history optimization approaches to this question, and highlight how this leads to the idea that lifespan and aging should be treated as two dimensions of the life trajectory, so to speak. And then I demonstrate how these will, if you take these two dimensions, then you can actually find strong macro level regularities on death patterns. And I also briefly mentioned that this can be extended to fertility. Okay, let's start. So this all begins with the big questions: why do we age? And when we are young, we may not ask this question, but as we get older, probably everybody, even before Aristotle, asked this question: why do I have to grow old? Why can I not stay young forever and keep my strengths and just keep on going like that until like some accident may kill me? So typically when you use the word aging, that's everybody understands maybe something else by it. So let me start defining the scientific term senescence, just so that we are all on the same page. So I will use the term senescence to define an increase in mortality or a decrease in fertility with adult age. Here you see that I depict basically three levels: the demographic, the physiological, and the genetic level. And mortality here is depicted in a cartoon where it falls from infant, like when you are born, until the age of reproductive maturity. And then in most species, mortality rises with age. So this is demographic or actuarial senescence. And this is also what I will focus about in this talk. Of course, the pattern of mortality that we eventually die is depending on physiological changes that underlie this. And we are not living in a vacuum. Of course, we are surrounded by an environment, and whether the environment is good or bad determines how likely it is that we die. But then underlying the physiology is a genetic component that, of course, determines how our body is built in the first place, and also like there can be also errors on the molecular level. So all this contributes to eventually and ultimately the outcome of death, to the demographic aging. Okay, so the question, why do we age? So why does mortality actually rise with age? That would be the true question here. The idea also of Darwin is that evolution shapes birth and death patterns, and birth and death, survival and reproduction are essential for evolutionary success. Now we define senescence as decreasing survival and decreasing reproduction with age. But if we consider that fitness, evolutionary fitness, is proportionally to survival and reproduction, then would that mean that senescence would actually diminish fitness? And wouldn't that mean that evolutionary speaking, we should just stay young forever because it's a disadvantage to grow old? So that was a kind of starting point that already Medavar in 1952 took to explain the evolution of aging. Why do we see senescence at all if it is detrimental for fitness? Well, the classic answer to this was given by William Hamilton in 1966, and he mathematically showed that we grow old, or okay, let me step back. He argued that we grow old because later ages matter less and less to evolutionary success. So that later ages matter less and less to evolutionary success, that he showed by mathematical equations of formulating how a small change in age-specific survival would affect fitness, or how a small change in age-specific reproduction would affect fitness. And from this work, he concluded that senescence is inevitable. Now, based on this reasoning of declining selection pressure with age, different theories have been put forward. The first is you get, so older ages are less important than younger ages. This is essentially what declining selection pressure means from an evolutionary perspective. And if later ages are unimportant, less important than younger ages, then mutations that affect higher and higher ages would face less and less opposition by evolution. And therefore, they could accumulate more and more in the genome, and progressively we would have a genome that could accumulate negative effects at higher ages, which could play out as an increase in mortality over age. So this is called as the mutation accumulation theory, due to Medavar in 1952. Then there is another general argument that fits to two theories, which the idea here is that a high weight of evolution, or high importance of there's a high weight on early life benefits, and this could outweigh late life costs. So either Williams in 1957 argued that there could be genes with antagonistic pleiotropic effects. So one gene has several effects at different ages that oppose each other. If you have a good effect early in life, then evolution would select for this good effect at the cost of the late life effect that might be bad. An alternative theory by Kirkwood in 1977, the disposable soma theory, argues slightly different. It says the body could save energy on maintaining the whole body, but just focus on keeping the germline perfect, and thereby just keep the soma, the body, in good enough shape until reproduction has been successful, and that would lead to an overall higher fitness than if you would try to keep the whole body away from senescence, so to speak. So this is the antagonistic pleiotropy theory and the disposable soma theory, which all basically come to the conclusion that there should be an inevitable senescence from reproductive maturity onwards, based on the assumption that mutations act age specifically, or in Kirkwood's case, that species have a distinction between the germline and the soma. So between those cell lines that make the next generations, and those cell lines that just make up the body, but that are not given towards the next generation. Another way of saying this is that these classic evolutionary theories predict that mortality should rise from maturity onwards. Now, in my PhD work, supervised by Jim Bopel, and in our subsequent collaborations, we developed a number of evolutionary demographic models, and we summarized our result in a paper in Science in 2012, where we demonstrate that theoretically, if you use life history optimization models, you can show that it can be, of course, optimal to have senescence, like in humans, the blue line, but you can also have constant mortality over adulthood from maturity to some arbitrary oldest age, where mortality is constant, like we observe in Hydra. Or it could even be that mortality can fall over some part of adult ages, as maybe observed in tortoises. So this is predicted by theory, and it would challenge the prediction that I just explained from classic theory. Now, why can we find that non-senescence can be optimal? Well, the key to our results are trade-offs. And the idea here underlying trade-offs is that an organism has a limited budget of energy and resources at its disposal, and these resources have to be allocated between survival and reproduction. And allocations that are beneficial for survival may not be invested into reproduction. And the question then remains, how much survival must be sacrificed to gain how much reproduction, and vice versa? So the key that decides whether or not it's worthwhile to invest just another unit of in survival is always in how much do I have to sacrifice on the other side. And this kind of constraints or balance between survival and reproduction that shapes a species life history trade-offs. And let me go into an example. Think of size, growth, and regeneration. Size, growth, and regeneration are processes that work against aging, if you like. And the benefits are that size can help avoid mortality. So look at the examples that I put here. The biggest fish in the pond will, if it is a predator, if you are bigger, the smaller ones can't eat you. This is the same as true also for alligators. The biggest risk for an alligator to die is to be eaten by a bigger alligator. But once you're the big alligator, you are basically safe. Or regeneration and repair capacities. There are, if you look across species, they have remarkable regenerative and repair mechanisms. And you can smash a hydra in small pieces, as long as some key elements are in this kind of remaining cell bulges, they can regrow the whole hydra. You can also cut this planaria worm that I've depicted here in pieces, and it can regrow the whole organism. So regeneration is a strong mechanism against aging, and even people have strong regenerative capacities in the gut and in the liver and you name it. Okay, growth is also important because it increases reproductive potential. So in many species, reproduction is proportional to body size. Think of trees, think here of fish, and also of reptiles, where the number of eggs, you can only have so many eggs in a small body, but the bigger the volume of the mother, the bigger also the volume of potential eggs. Not of the single eggs, but the collection of eggs, of course. The cost, however, is also there. If you want to grow, it takes time and it takes resources. And if it takes time, that means you have to delay reproduction. If you delay reproduction, you risk to die before you even start reproducing to give your genome to the next generation. Also, if you are bigger, it requires maintenance costs because you have to energetically support the whole body, and there's also then more damage in all, like there are more cells means more damage, means more repair costs. Also, if you're bigger, for example, in alligators or in species where males fight with each other, if you will be more challenged and you have to fight against other like competitors. So size is also it brings costs and depends on what kind of species you are thinking of. In general, modeling for what species, which type of allocation in survival and reproduction, and in survival here I'm thinking growth, which benefits survival, which is optimal. You can think of an organism changes over time, but it's not age itself that matters, but the state in which the organism is in at a certain age. And that state changes depending on the damage that the organism experiences, and on the other side, the repair and regeneration ability the organism has. But whether or not it will use this opportunity to regenerate and to repair depends on whether it is actually optimal to repair the damage that occurred. So there is an optimal energy allocation for a species, and this will determine the aging pattern. And in this theoretical framework, which is kind of obvious, if damage exceeds repair, then there will be senescence and mortality increase with age. If damage and repair balance out, then we can expect there is something one may call sustenance. So there's no change over age, or kind of cyclical, degrading and then repair, but kind of staying on the same level. And then if damage is small, like if you actually over repair, so you're basically learning and your muscles, like you train your muscles, there is a little bit of insult, but then the body actually knows, okay, I have to grow bigger, so there can be growth and enhancement. Mathematically, how we solve this is, in general, we maximize lifetime reproductive success. Here, capital R is reproductive success, is the sum from over all ages. Here we are, if over all ages from 0 to infinity, but it's kind of the age when no individual is alive. Alex is probably.
Szeminárium az öregedésről.
Was that a question? No. So Alex is the number of individuals, or is a proportion of individuals surviving to age X, and MX is the reproduction at age X. And the question for the optimization question for the model is, in the beginning, of course, every organism has to start growing into a mature organism. So all resources go into growth. And then the question becomes, at what age is it optimal to allocate some of the available resources into reproduction? And then how much would you invest to grow? How much do you invest to reproduce? That was like the simplified vision that we had in our models. Just to go back. So basically, this was our starting point of life history optimization models using basic survival function and reproduction function, and how we found the optimal life history trajectory. And with that, we found that senescence and non-senescence can be optimal. But when we go back to the start, how can we reconcile this with Hamilton's results that senescence is optimal, because he is inevitable, because he did have mathematical equations to prove that, and that mathematics is correct. Now, together with my PhD student, Martin Wensing and Thomas Richer, we showed that, in fact, you have to look at Hamilton's results a little bit from a broader perspective, because he did not include trade-offs. In fact, he himself knew how important trade-offs are. He highlighted the importance of trade-offs in this paper, but in his framework, he treats mortality and fertility separately, and he assumes that there is no interaction between mortality and fertility. And what we have done here in this paper, what we have explained, is that he only quantified one side of the story. He quantified how a change in mortality affects fitness, and how a change in mortality affects how a change in fertility affects fitness, but you have to also include the effects among each other, so to speak. And we show that this the missing bits of his equation, so to speak. But still, our approach and also Hamilton's approach is static, so it's incomplete, because you can only calculate the force of selection at a change in mortality or fertility at a specific age if, in a snapshot, these are the current patterns of birth and death, and now you can ask, if I change birth and death at this age a little bit, how much would it affect fitness? But then selection pressure affects the mortality and fertility patterns, and then they change, and then that will change the selection pressure. So you have to move to evolutionary equilibrium, and this we haven't done, and Hamilton hasn't done, but it has been done luckily recently in a paper of 2022 Nature Communications. by Stefano Giarimo, who was my former postdoc, and Arne Trausen, who is director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology in Plön. They developed a fully dynamic model of life history evolution, and they showed that once trade-offs are kept out of the picture and any sorts of age-specific genetic effects is allowed. So just to step back, Hamilton had assumed that there are additive effects of a mutation at an age on mortality and on fertility. I have also worked on this, and I have looked at proportional effects, and I show how that changes the result and that selection pressure can increase and so on. But importantly, these two authors, they show that whatever age-specific genetic effect you allow, once you keep trade-offs out of the picture, in evolutionary equilibrium, aging remains the one and only stable outcome of evolution. And that's an absolute key result. When fecundity and survival evolve independently at each age, aging is evolutionary inevitable. So basically, these two authors make the case that that trade-offs are absolutely essential to explain the evolution of non-senescence patterns that we actually do see in nature. We see that there is flat and also falling mortality patterns in nature, and they cannot be explained if you take mortality and fertility as independent. Okay, I think I'm probably speaking a little bit too fast. Please stop me if I'm totally running away. I try to speak a bit slower. But yeah, this is basically a key result that takes the results of Hamilton and generalizes it and makes it dynamic, and shows that no matter what you do in his model of age-specific mutations in a dynamic model, you always get aging as the only evolutionary, senescence as the only evolutionary stable strategy. So the take-home message is that within Hamilton's framework, aging inevitably must evolve, and life history optimization models of trade-offs show, in the contrary, that aging patterns can be diverse, including non-aging. So that is why Hamilton and these optimization models lead to different results. The key difference is trade-offs. Now, so from these evolutionary demographic models, where are we standing? So basically, it changed the question, the initial question, from why we age to why we age, we humans age, and many other mammals too, but some species, like for example Hydra or tortoise, might not age. And when you look at here, this little written x-axis, which is age, it does not, excuse me, it doesn't show time units. It just says maturity, adulthood, oldest age. And this is because here in this stylized picture, we standardize time simply from the age of reproductive maturity until the age when 95% of adults are dead. And it reflects that in these evolutionary demographic models, the outcome, the optimal outcome of whether or not senescence was an optimal life history strategy, was independent of time units. That means it was independent of whether a species lives years or minutes or centuries. It didn't matter. So optimizing for increasing or decreasing mortality is independent of time. And therefore, these models theoretically motivate to measure and study lifespan. So why we live as long as we live, this question, from aging. So why mortality goes up or down. So I argued that lifespan and aging are two dimensions, and it would make sense to study them separately. And when we looked at aging across a tree of life, we found like a diversity of patterns. And here, this is many species. I don't want to see you all the details. The red lines is mortality over age. And here, let me pick out two. You see here a goat and a oarweed, and they live a relatively short life, like they mature at age 1 and live about 8-9 years. And the red line increases for the chamois, the goat. That means they have a short life and they age. They show senescence, while the oarweed also has a similarly long lifespan, but mortality, the red line, declines over adult age. The dashed line there is the average level of mortality. So it's the mortality y-axis here is standardized by the mean level of the average level of mortality for that species. And similarly, when you look at long-lived species like humans, for example, here hunter-gatherer data, then we see that we clearly have an increasing pattern of mortality over age. Comparing this here with data for the Gopherus agassiz desert tortoise, they have a roughly similarly long life, whereas they don't have increasing but decreasing mortality. So you can have different combinations of the same lifespan, but qualitatively different aging patterns. So that question comes, of course, up now. What combinations of pace and shape, or sorry, I have not yet introduced these words, but what combinations of lengths of life and aging pattern can we find? In what lifespans can be combined with what type of aging? So let me get me back to the red thread here. So from this, theoretical results and empirical observations motivate to conceptualize, model and measure lifespan, which I call the pace of life, and aging, which I call the shape dimension of aging. So how is the shape of the trajectory of mortality? Does it go up or down? We should treat this as separate dimensions when we study data on survival and mortality. And then when we do that, so we have actually done this. For example, here in a study by Aburto and colleagues in 2019, we looked at the human mortality database for 49 countries and regions over time from 1900 until today, or until the last when we have data. And we can see a very strong linear relationship with lifespan, E0, or life expectancy, and the shape of aging, which is here measured by the logarithm of the ratio of lifespan divided by life years lost. So this funny symbol, E dagger, is the average life years you lose when you die. And this is a measure of relative lifespan inequality, or you can also think of it, it is something else, but it's like the coefficient of variation. It's a relative measure of inequality in lifespan. Similarly, Colchero et al. In 2016 in PNAS found a linear relationship across human populations. Here in the middle, we have hunter-gatherer populations and historical populations, and the violet pictures, violet points here are primate populations, different species. And the little tails that you see there, this is male, the head is female and the tail is males. But that's just, and most of the tadpoles, so the male-female difference also aligns with the linear relationship between pace and shape of aging. And Colchero et al. Actually have looked more deeply into the primates, and they also find in a recent paper in Nature Communication 2021, this is work led by Fernando Colchero and Susan Alberts, they find for, here the gray line is the human line that they had in the 2016 paper, that we had in the 2016 paper. And you can see for chimpanzees, for capuchin monkeys, for gorillas, baboons, sifaka, these are data from wild populations and from captive populations. And you can see that they all pretty much fall on linear relationships between lifespan, life expectancy and lifespan inequality, or equality. Sorry, I'm going back and forth between equality and inequality. It's the same thing. So the take home here is that if you properly measure basically lifespan and inequality separately, then you can reveal strong macro level regularities, which might be helpful actually in modeling mortality and forecasting mortality in populations across different environments. For example, forecasting human mortality over time, or also forecasting how gorillas or chimpanzees mortality will change if they are in different environmental conditions. Now, recently, I extended the framework also to fertility in the paper in Methods in Ecology and Evolution together with Ian Stott, which is called A Pace and Shape Perspective on Fertility. And I developed the formal demographic methodology that is basically linked to this idea recently, which is called the born ones, die ones, life table relationships for fertility. And why this is very demographic, it's in demographic research in a formal relationship. So it's very kind of to a demographic audience, but still relevant across fields. But the observation here is we all have to die once, and we are also all born once. And I call this like the fundamental principle of life, or the fundamental principle of existence, because in this very simple observations of the cornerstones of life, you're born, you live, you die, we can actually mirror methods from birth to death analysis, or actually from death to birth analysis. And that is actually what I proposed in my ERC Consolidator grant that I was so lucky to get, which is called Towards a Transdisciplinary Theory of Birth and Death. And just a very, very little announcement. So of course, I need people to work on a systematic search and modeling of macro level regularities in human fertility patterns, applying mathematical tools from mortality analysis. And it would be ideally to work with people from demography, fertility research, experience and modeling, data analysis, quantitative approaches. Anyway, that is just like a small call to those of you who are in the coming years going up for postdoc positions. And with that, let me just end with the last message here, that the pace and shape framework, which I think is very helpful to quantify mortality patterns, has been extended to fertility. And I think I can see large potential how this can serve as a basis for future developments. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. It's a little bit in a bubble over here, but that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking talk, and we have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, I was maybe running a little bit too fast. Normally I say probably more on each of these slides.
That's okay, because if we have questions, at least we have
I can elaborate.
Yeah, exactly, we have time to explain these things. Do we have any questions from the audience? While people are thinking, maybe because that might not be a very trivial concept. So if you could go back to this lifespan inequality or equality thing and explain this. Yeah, this one. Exactly. This? Yeah. So how can we interpret the shapes or the y-axis here? So,
we can interpret that as, so actually I have some, let me go, because I have some more slides, because I wasn't sure how much time I will need. So let me just go to the last slide here. I'm explaining this pace and shape actually here. So maybe this will be helpful. So here, the measure that I'm using in this figure is essentially the log of the inverse of entropy. And here you can see that for example, take the human increasing mortality with age. If people die, they typically lose, so this age dagger here, this is the years you lose when you die. And typically the lifespan, the numbers of years that you lose when you die is less than your life expectancy at maturity, let's say. So when I'm 15, then I have whatever 60 years of life ahead. And when I die on average on age 80, then maybe I lose 5 years or 8 years or something like that. So the ratio is smaller. This is here is smaller than 1. So if the years you lose when you die on average are smaller than your lifespan, then entropy is smaller than 1. And why is there, here's a number missing here? It should say if entropy is equal to 1, then these numbers, you always lose the same amount of lifespan no matter when you die, which is, if mortality is constant, every age is like is the same, like you are born and that is your life expectancy at birth, so to speak. And if mortality falls over age, like in this tortoise here, then the older you are, the less risk of death you are facing. So when you die at later ages, then you have more to lose. So this E dagger is larger than E0, and so the entropy here is larger than 1. And then if you take the log of that and then the inverse that was in this figure that I showed, you can distinguish with this number increasing or decreasing mortality pattern. And this increasing and decreasing mortality also is directly associated with the spread of lifespan. So if you imagine a distribution of death, if mortality increases, we have a death hump, and most people die in this hump, and there's a pretty much determinate lifespan. So it's a defined lifespan for our species. But if mortality is flat, like in Hydra, then, the Hydra just dies all over the place. And you cannot say, most Hydra die at this age, because some die very young and some die very much older. And if mortality is even falling, then the spread of lifespan becomes even more extreme. So now does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's clear. The follow-up question is that I don't know about Hydra and the tortoise, but definitely in the humans, the tricky thing is that life expectancy at birth has changed a lot over the past century. So if we go back to your original figure, how does that take this into account, that the life expectancy itself and therefore the years that you lose when you die might have also changed? So that's what I still having some issues to understand how.
Yeah, so the figure that I showed, like, let me just go, because here I'm just explaining these measures because I wasn't sure how much question there are coming. Not so much to there. I'm not 100% sure whether this is from birth or from reproductive maturity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is from birth. And until the 1950s, roughly, lifespan was increasing because we were improving infant mortality.
Mm-hmm.
But the effect is that all the early deaths that has been averted they now gain the lifespan that everybody else has. So they are piling up on this hill of, on the distribution of deaths, which gets kind of higher and higher. And that makes mortality rising steeper and steeper, and lifespans become more and more equal. So by saving infant deaths, also in monkeys, you are narrowing the distribution of deaths, and you increase equality in lifespan in the sense that more and more individuals in the population share the same expected lifespan. They are more and more close, die more and more closely together.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other question? Yeah.
Janos, you are muted. We cannot hear you. Yeah.
Okay, now, I wonder how the environmental stability contributes to the shape of aging.
Yeah, so in very risky environments, like in these monkey populations also, when they die a lot, when you have very high infant mortality, and then a few individuals live very long because they don't die of infant mortality and then actually have quite a long life ahead of them, this increases lifespan inequality. So they are in these pictures here on the lower end of the y-axis. Yeah. And as environmental conditions improve, and you don't have as much environmental death, if you want to call it that way, more and more people or organisms die at a later age. And if mortality is increasing in that species, then you have a more and more rectangular survival curve, and more narrow hump of death in the death distribution.
Okay, because I think that is what exactly happened in the last 100 century in modern humans.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's exactly that was what happened. So okay. like a wave, like you have taken the death, like a transport, like you are, Jim Urban always says, you take like sand with a shovel, you shovel the sand from the young ages onto the heap of the old age, and you are transporting basically more and more deaths to the typical, the age when you should be dying around. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? I have a couple of more questions. So if there are no questions from the audience, or while they're thinking, I can ask a couple of more questions if you don't mind. So the first thing is that there's a very characteristic shape in the human mortality patterns, is that it's exponentially increasing to a point, but around the age of like the centenarians, actually the mortality starts decreasing. So the first question is that what can we say about that, or is there any in other animals can we see something like this? And the second thing is that how can we incorporate this into the analysis?
Yeah, you are completely right. So after age 80, roughly, mortality starts leveling off, and eventually it becomes flat for centenarians at age 110 or 105 or 110 around. And Jim Voppel proposed the theory of heterogeneity for that. So in his theory, individuals differ, and the frailer individuals die first, leaving the remaining population stronger. And that means that at a certain point, the selection effect that kind of takes out the weak individuals is so strong that it affects the average mortality in the population so much that it leads to this kind of eventual plateau. Because just the individual aging of those individuals who are still in the population is kind of exactly balanced by the removal of the frailest individuals. And he has a whole framework for that, quantifying the degree of frailty that is needed to get this plateau. He shows together with Trifon Misov that frailty has to be gamma distributed in the population. That the aging rate on the individual level has to be roughly 0.14, or actually for a cohort 0.15. Yeah, so there is this, if you're interested, it's a theory of heterogeneous populations.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Adam Körösi. Go ahead, Adam.
Hello, thank you very much for this very nice talk. My question would be about the sexual differences in aging. So males and females are usually under different selection pressures, and females may benefit from a longer lifespan, while males not necessarily. Can you give us some kind of guidelines how to approach the sexual differences in aging? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in humans, we generally see, at least over the last century, that women normally, or women live on average 3 to 5 years longer than men. And in many other species, in humans and birds, not in humans, in mammals and birds, this is also the case, that typically the females live longer than males. It's not always the case. There have been proposed different theories to explain this male-female gap, this female survival advantage. And it's also not always the case. We are just working on a study in testudines. Is that the right way of saying that in English? Tortoises and turtles. And there, often the males live longer than the females because they are bigger. And females also suffer from male aggression. In the fighting and so on, but in how was it now? Let me remember. But in some cases, the females live longer than the males, and that is typically when the females are bigger than the males. That so there is this. The general guideline is like size is definitely related to mortality, and if there is a size dimorphism, then often the bigger sex lives longer. And actually I also heard of evidence, but now I'm getting a little bit on shaky ground, but in data from Canada, Quebec, there was actually females living shorter than males in humans also. So I don't know, like I'm also living in this paradigm of women live longer than men, but I wonder whether if we had better historical data, whether we would find that females actually live shorter than males because of the size, like because men are physically stronger and because women die typically in childbirth and so on. So, but I don't know that. That is like some bits and pieces that I know there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Janos, go ahead.
Is it possible that male life expectancy is lower in humans because they basically fight more, so they have a more risky young adult life than women, and that there is one hypothesis that testosterone has some immunosuppressive impact on males in general, and that would damage the repair system.
Yeah, I also have, like, I'm not an expert on that, but I have also heard about this this possibility. Yes. Let me remember. Yeah, there's also this idea that simply men are like, they don't go to the doctor. So there is this paradox of you know, men die younger but healthy, and women die older but sick. And it's evolutionary. One would probably argue that it is evolutionary disadvantageous for males to show weakness, because that's like, they have to be strong and they cannot show to their competitors that they are not strong. So that's like the worst that the man can do, even though he probably feels as much as a woman that something is wrong with him. He doesn't go to the doctor because he's evolutionary prone not to actually admit that there is something seriously wrong. That might be, you know, I don't know whether this has an official name, this kind of theory, but to me, that I think I have heard that, and that makes sense. So probably it has like a name. A
kind of collateral damage.
Yeah. Or there's the other theory, I think it probably also has, I'm not writing papers on this, so I don't know the names, but that there is on the X chromosome is protective, because women have 2 X chromosomes and men just 1, and this X chromosome is some sort of a backup. If something goes wrong on one chromosome, the woman has another one, and the man doesn't have the backup, and therefore the females may live longer. That is another explanation.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see this, or
I don't see the chat, no.
Okay, so question: how can we know whether the death of any organism is due to aging or any other reasons like diseases? Or how did you consider the contribution of parasites or diseases to aging?
Oh, that's a very great question. It's so hard to say why an organism died and whether it's due to aging or not, like, because it's an interaction, like it's always an interaction between the state. Like, for example, say you are eaten by a predator, then you would say, you know, it's an external cause of death because you're eaten by the predator. But the reason that the predator got you was because you were slower than the other animals, and you were probably slower because of aging. You know, so how do you disentangle that? Or you are hit by a car, but maybe you were hit by a car because your reaction speed was just a little bit too slow, or your eyesight was just a little bit bad. So it's very hard to say this is a cause due to aging and this not. Of course, you know, we try to classify this, and there is cause of death registries. First of all, there is a challenge how to register the death. Is this you know, how can you exactly see what is the reason? But then, yes, people typically classify causes of death more like old age diseases. Like if you die from falling when you are young, it's probably not classified as an old age disease, but as you know, accident. But dying from falling when you are 100 is probably more classified as a cause of death is aging, because you're not dying from the mere fall, but because your bones are brittle and your bones break. And normally when you fall as a child, your bones don't break. So there is this, I'm not sure whether I can give a short answer. It's a shorter answer than that.
Thank you. We had another question. Csaba Kerepesi raised his hand. Actually, Csaba gave a presentation in the same seminar series a few weeks ago about aging. And
oh, okay.
Csaba, welcome back.
Thank you.
Nice meeting
hello,
you.
everyone, and thank you for the talk. It was very nice, and I very enjoyed it because I'm very interested in this topic. And in the lab where I worked at the Harvard, Vadim Gladishev, maybe you know him.
Say the name again?
Do you know Vadim Gladishev?
Yeah, I know him, yeah.
Yeah, I worked at his lab 2 years as a postdoc, and we show that the naked morat ages epigenetically, even though it has a constant mortality rate. So how is it possible if the mortality rate represents aging?
Yeah, that's really an exciting question, because you basically detected epigenetic changes, right?
Yes.
And you call it, but why do you call it aging?
Epigenetic. Yes, it's a good question, but it's the
because I remember discussing with Vadim about these things, because I said, like, we are observing a change, and with our human eye, we judge it as something bad, this change. But eventually, who judges whether the change that you saw on the epigenetic level, like, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying, you know, is it aging? Probably there is something damaged, and then we would say, okay, it is not functioning anymore, so it's damaged. But if mortality didn't change, that means it has not perpetuated up into the highest scale, so it wasn't visible. It didn't affect the risk of dying. So I think it could probably be classified as senescence on the molecular level.
Thank you.
Fair enough, like, obviously. And there might be a time delay, like maybe it has to be some time for these changes, or there is a threshold. And then when this epigenetic changes reach the threshold, then it goes to the higher level. It's
maybe. Yes, it's an open question.
It's an
Yeah,
open
so I think
thank you for.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. And the other thing, the turtles. The other thing, when you see mortality decrease, as in the case of turtles, does it mean that it's rejuvenation or?
Yeah, thank you also for this question, because both questions are really relevant. I want to stress, and I try to stress that on the first slide, that really we are looking at the demographic level, at the ultimate outcome of all the physiological, genetic, epigenetic, environmental interaction effects. We see, is the organism dead or alive? And what is under the hood? Like, I would never claim that the improvement in mortality is actually a rejuvenation. It just means that the compound effect of physiological changes, changes in body size, change in, you know, skills, learning, everything, behavior that the organism does, it together resulted in improvement in survival. I can also have an improvement in survival simply by being put in a different environment without me changing at all, and I wouldn't call that rejuvenation. So it's we are simply looking at the output, at the outcome at the end. So and evolution, but this is also what evolution does. And I guess that's where I'm always coming back to. In the end, for evolution counts, I mean, evolution doesn't care, but, you know, did you leave an offspring or not? And even if you know, if you were almost dead, but you still, you know, managed to get your offspring out, fine, you know, you got it. So it's, we look with our human judgment of, okay, there is something getting worse, but.
Thank you. Sorry for these provocative questions.
No, I love it.
I was just wondering your opinion about this.
Yeah.
That's this important question.
And I have to actually add that we are currently working on this turtles paper, and it's under review in Science. And we don't find as like this tortoise, I have this tortoise picture on the negative senescence, but we don't find in that data set negative senescence for that particular tortoise that we found in the Nature paper, but that data were not as good data. And we do find negative senescence for for 2 turtles that we study in the data set that we currently have in captivity. So I do still think that there is negative senescence in some turtles or tortoises, I don't know. But it's really, I think more and more of the evidence for negative or negligible senescence in the future may turn out to be actually senescence if we look deeper. But I also think that we will find more evidence for negative senescence as we look into species that we currently don't have data on, because our species bias is strong towards mammals and birds, and even within the mammals towards a narrow range of clades in there. So I think there will be both these 2 movements. Like we will have to take back evidence on negative senescence that we thought there is, and then I hope that we're getting some new. And I'm really trusting into the Hydra, because I'm pretty confident that these results are actually true.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so I think these are really crucial things to discriminate between, like you said, the demographic aging and physiological aging. And yeah, thank you, Csaba, for asking this question. I had the same questions. So yeah, so what can we say about the turtles or tortoises? Definitely, it's not rejuvenation, because they're still kind of grow old and die, but there's might be actually different patterns in the demographic level and the physiological level.
Yeah.
We have another question in the chat. I would like to read this to you. Life history trade-offs and their resource allocation basis has been recently questioned. The core of your models and results is life history trade-offs. How can this be reconciled?
Well, I would actually love, because I can see that I am not up to date. I would really love to get the paper that questioned life history trade-offs, like that the person is referring to. What I could, so I have to say, so I don't know in what way they have been questioned. Maybe I can just, in what way have the life history trade-offs been questioned?
I don't know, Csongor, if you can join and explain what you mean, or. So I think, I don't know if Csongor has the connection, so he can join. Yeah, but okay. there are some laboratory studies, for example, where they could actually break the apparent trade-off between reproduction and survival with for example, when they remove the germline in C. elegans. There's a paper by I don't know if no, Linda Partridge probably is not part of this, but
But if you remove the germline, in a sense, you are removing the kind of headquarters of reproduction. So you are removing this source or this kind of pull of energy. So then there is no, maybe there's
well, exactly, that was more complicated than that, because I think in that study, I don't remember exactly, but I think in that study what they did is that there were several manipulations. So they were ablation of the somatic gonads as well, and the germline, also specifically the germline. And so what they found is that the trade-off between reproduction and survival was dependent on whether only the somatic tissues were affected or the germline was affected.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Therefore, they concluded that there are some very specific germline signals that actually reduce lifespan. And so there's also a whole theory, I'm sure you're familiar with that, because some of the people from UCL that you probably work together are very strong proponents of this theory of programmatic theories of aging, or like hyperfunctional theories of aging, that actually suggest that aging is not something accidental, but actually something that, you know, happens for a reason and is actually actively controlled by some genes. And of course, this is highly and hotly debated, but so I'm just trying to, you know, chime in what Csongor might think, but I'm not a translator, so
I can, with this whole programmed aging, it's difficult. I think I have to think about this more, because I don't fully agree, but as you say, it's hotly debated. Yeah,
it's very hotly debated, but at least you know, I think that these theories come from people who actually approach this question from a very different perspective that you do, because you have a very strong demographic perspective, and these people have completely the opposite, the physiological and genetic perspective. And therefore, I think this is why it is interesting when you have contrasting results between the two approaches, or at least seemingly contrasting, how can this be reconciled. We also had a question from Beata. I don't know if she still wants to ask.
Yes, here I am. I just thought that lunchtime is approaching, so I was not sure whether to ask, but if the answer is too long, just skip it, please. So the question is about age-specific competitive ability. I'm a plant ecologist, and interspecific competition is the ability to compete interspecifically. Is very much depends, of course, on the age. Thinking of a large tree and a little sapling, for example. So is this kind of advantage of age considered in the model you are using? And also another question, which is also a typical plant ecologist question, because I'm dealing with sedentary organisms. So being present in a place can be a very big advantage, especially in case of founder-controlled communities. So the newcomer is always in a disadvantage.
Yeah, so I can give a relatively short answer. So we have not included that any kind of inter or intra-species competition. There is a paper by Doncaster and Seymour already several years back, 2003 or something, about this tree. Like, I don't think they call it founder effects, but essentially they say that there is a selection for longevity. Once you are in a place like a tree, then it makes sense that you continue to survive and outlive your neighbors, so that your offspring eventually have an advantage, because they can fall into the opening that your death will leave. If your neighbors die before you, then your offspring can fall into that opening. You don't want you to die and then your neighbors putting their offspring into your place. So therefore, they have a model for runaway selection for longer and longer lives in trees. That may be interesting to you. And the other thing about plants and interspecies competition, in the Plantago lanceolata studies by Deborah Roach, she had cohorts for different years, and in summers, I think that were particularly rainy, there was a lot of overgrowth. So the Plantago had to compete a lot with plants that grew over them, and there she found significant differences between age for Plantago of the same size. So there because she had a hard, like initially we thought there's negative senescence in Plantago, and I would still think there is, but you can detect physiological changes in competitiveness, so that the chance of, or the risk of death was higher for individuals of larger age of similar size. And we saw, like, so there are two plants of the same size, and the older plant would have a higher risk than the younger one in bad conditions. So when they had to compete in this overgrowth, then the younger plants were better at that. So the aging only showed under stress, so to speak. And that also goes back to Csaba's question in terms of under the hood aging. You know, or also there was a question by Jonas Oni Janusz under the different environmental conditions. You could have underlying aging on the physiological or epigenetic level, but it's not under normal conditions, not visible. But when you stress the individuals, then you actually see that those individuals with underlying physiological or genetic changes may compete or may do worse. But it's really hard to, detect that in the data. Then you have different cohorts with different environmental conditions, and you have to measure all these physiological variables. But to see it on the demographic level, there has to be this competition, for example, as one stressor to see how strong you can compete.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions. So with that, I think we can conclude the session, and thank again, Annette, for your very interesting talk. As you can see, it generated a lot of ideas and potential discussions. So
yeah, thank you for your very interesting questions. It's also fun to think about it, and again think, how do you actually explain this? I enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you very much again, and good luck with your new project.
Thank you.
Some of the PhD students will be interested in joining your lab later. And so, yeah, thank you again, and have a nice rest of your day for everyone. And thank you for coming and participating. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.